morning, everyone. My name is Tracy Lamb. I'm the Director of Programs and Communications at Partners in Diversity. Thank you so much for being here and being part of this month's Breakfast for Champions. It's our regular educational series to help you enhance diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. First, a few housekeeping items. The chat box has been disengaged. For questions to the panelists during the audience Q&A portion, please use the Q&A box. This session is being recorded and will be sent to you after the event. Today's program is live captioned. To activate that feature, hover over the menu on the bottom of your screen and select the closed captioning icon. And here's a quick look at programs over the next few months. For October's Breakfast for Champions, we are bringing back Professor John Powell from the Othering and Belonging Institute for more on targeted universalism. He and his team will walk us through a hands-on workshop to put targeted universalism into action. It is a 2-hour workshop and involves small group work. Many of the attendees of his previous session requested that we bring him back, so thank you for that feedback. The link to register for that workshop is being posted in the chat box. On November 10th, Breakfast for Champions will take on the topic of building a successful employee resource group. It's something that many of you have requested, so we look forward to seeing you there. The registration link is not quite ready yet, but we will send that out as soon as it's available. Also in November is Say Hey. It is Native American Heritage Month, so I hope you will join us to celebrate. We're still finalizing the date and the details, and we'll send you the registration link as soon as it is available. Thanks again for being here. Now I'd like to introduce the Executive Director of Partners in Diversity, Mari Watanabe.
Hey, thank you, Tracy. Welcome everyone to Partners in Diversity's Breakfast for Champions. Today's topic is 16 months in the making. It's been 1.5 years since the horror of George Floyd's murder. Some people have called this past year a racial reckoning. In response, companies big and small waved the Black Lives Matter flag and promised to take action against systemic racism. So, what has changed? What have we learned as employers and organizational leaders? What more can be done? First, let's take a look at what has been promised. Last year, America's 50 biggest public companies collectively committed a little more than $49 billion to address racial inequality. But a recent Washington Post investigation found that so far, about $45 billion or 90% of that is allocated as loans or investments. These are things that the companies stand to gain from. A little more than $4 billion were outright grants. $4 billion sounds like a lot, but that's less than 1% of the net income earned by those top companies. Yet the need and desire for racial equality, diversity, equity, and inclusion isn't going away. At the risk of inundating you with numbers, here are a few more I'd like you to consider this morning. 67% of job seekers consider workplace diversity an important factor when considering employment opportunities. And more than 50% of current employees want their workplace to do more to increase diversity. Research has shown that a lack of diversity in an organization hampers innovation, prohibits members of marginalized groups from being recognized for their contributions, and fails to meet client expectations. Lack of diversity also leads to discrimination. Last year, Partners in Diversity released the Workforce Retention Project that showed 74% of professionals of color experienced discrimination at work. This is not to say that nothing has been done. We know that this work takes time, discipline, and long-term commitment. Many companies and organizations, big and small, are putting in the time and energy and money, like the ones on our panel today. Here's the plan for this morning. We will start off with a short presentation to look at trends and themes from the past year, as well as some common DEI pitfalls that prevent companies from realizing meaningful outcomes. It will help set the stage for our panel discussion with leaders representing the private sector, public sector, and nonprofit. Finally, we will have time for audience questions. Please use the Q&A box. You can upvote someone else's question as well. Now I want to introduce you to our presenter, panelist, and moderator for the morning. Our presenter and one of the panelists is Marin Heiskell. She is the Human Capital Manager and Consumer Industry Lead for Deloitte's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion practice. She leads several DEI initiatives at Deloitte, oversees the design and rollout of new D&I eminence and learning modules, manages DEI recruitment and retention programs, and serves as a strategic advisor to key DEI partners and customer clients. Also on our panel is Simone Brooks. She is the Assistant City Manager for the City of Hillsboro. Simone is responsible for community and organizational connectivity and engagement. She leads the Human Resources, Parks and Recreation, and Library departments, as well as the Community Service and Communications and Marketing teams. Rounding out our panel is Chris Chiacchierini. He has been the Executive Director of Neighborhood House since 2017. He served missions centered on youth homelessness and chemical dependency. His work also centered on personal care for adults with developmental disabilities, education, employment, and affordable health care. Leading us in this discussion is Dr. Allison Davis White-Eyes. She is the Director of Community Diversity Relations at Oregon State University. Her accomplishments include the creation of 7 cultural resource centers, as well as intersectional, multimodal student learning and engagement programs. She is also a Partners in Diversity Leadership Council member. So we are going to begin with Marin and her presentation. So Marin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm going to be sharing my screen here. All right. So what we're going to talk about really is just the need and impetus for change, and then ultimately what we are seeing happen, particularly in consumer as it relates to diversity and equity and inclusion, with a focus on what's happening specifically in the workforce due to those kind of external and societal pressures that we're seeing, much of it due to what has happened over the last 15 months or so with the George Floyd murder, along with some of the other social justice issues, the election, and so on and so forth. And then ultimately, kind of what are some pitfalls that we're seeing because diversity and inclusion, as we know, is not new. But what has really kept a lot of companies from really driving that transformation that they had in mind when they put together their strategies? So, no need to introduce myself again. Amari did a great job of introducing me here. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So really, one of the things that we're seeing is an environment that is a sense that really understands a sense of urgency around diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is different from 2 years ago when it was an afterthought, not only in terms of strategy, but an afterthought also in terms of budget, where I felt like sometimes we would have to either really fight to get clients to understand that just as you would invest 6 or 7 figures in business transformations, finance and technology transformations, that DEI transformation deserves similar investment. So what we've seen now with this call to action around social justice, the COVID-19 pandemic, which has not only accelerated companies' needs to rethink the concept of work, but it's really changed the way that we work and subsequently changed the way that we've needed to approach the whole sense of particularly inclusion and that sense of belonging. And so really at the center of navigating all of this, you're seeing these social and business imperatives really collide and really manifest in an urgency around diversity, equity, and inclusion. What I have here on the slide are just a few things we'd like to share with clients when we're talking to them about, hey, the time is now to take action. First being the quote from Angela Davis, and we like to use that to say, there's not really an option to do nothing. Right? You have to be actively anti-racist or actively take action to be diverse and inclusive. It's not something that's just going to happen by accident. And also on the right, some of the metrics around the importance of diversity and inclusion, particularly as we now approach having 4 different generations and on the cusp of 5 generations in the workforce, with baby boomers, Gen Xers, I say the lost forgotten group that I belong in, millennials, Gen Zers, and now we have Gen Alpha, which is getting ready to graduate from college. And every generation has a different expectation and different demographic. The first being that 80% of the world's talent source, and that means college educated, is now women and people of color. This happened as of last year. 83% of millennials are more actively engaged in organizations that they believe foster inclusive cultures. Of course, we also see the higher impact on revenue and sales, as well as customer satisfaction on those organizations that really focus a lot on diversity and inclusion. So there is also a key business imperative involved in this. This is not just a moral imperative and the quote unquote right thing to do. So why have these efforts failed? Pretty much it's because inequity is enterprise-wide. What many of you likely have recognized is that equity has been, I don't want to say a new concept in diversity and inclusion, but it's been newly included in diversity and inclusion conversations. The way we like to think of it at Deloitte is that equity is an outcome or a desired outcome of diversity and inclusion. While diversity is getting people in the door, and inclusion is about how you engage and retain and develop those people, the desired outcome of when they work together, and they kind of work together in a yin-yang relationship, is more equitable outcomes. So since we haven't really talked a lot about equity, we've been trying to put this Band-Aid of diversity and inclusion, get more people in the pipeline, or get people working together better on something that really does not have a solid foundation and has not been a desired outcome consistently across the board. What you see here on this slide are some inequities that tend to persist, starting at the top around pay equity. While there's been definitely a talk around gender pay equity, even when we double click on that, you see a racial inequity amongst women. Okay. With representation, we are still dealing with amongst the Fortune 500, still abysmal numbers, just 1% of Black leaders being CEOs of a Fortune 500 company, despite representing over 13% of the population. And also I'd like to add on that as of 2 years ago, African-American women, on a per capita kind of basis or per person basis became the most educated demographic in the US when it comes to graduate degrees. So also paying more attention to that representation number and if that needle will move. In the marketplace, you are seeing consumers more likely to be motivated by action, by inclusive ads. All right, so there's this preference for ads that are highly representative of various communities, or even just the action that is taken after seeing an ad in which someone sees themselves or sees a usually marginalized or underrepresented community included. And the market rewards those businesses accordingly. You see the better business performance and the average stock increase year over year when it comes to those companies that really prioritize diversity as part of their business strategy. And then society, what kind of community kind of servant or community citizen are these businesses? You've seen just in the last year or so, the NASDAQ asking the SEC to require listed companies to meet specific diversity requirements. I'm also seeing this with consumer clients when it comes to making decisions about vendors and who they will work with, just stopping and saying, hey, we want to see your board diversity. We want to see your leadership diversity. We want to see your diversity and inclusion strategy, or maybe even the budget behind it, becoming a key factor in those sorts of vendor negotiations on both ends. Okay. And it's stakeholders, not just shareholders. Right? You've seen business roundtables and other different letters that are signed by CEOs and other leaders really committing themselves to being effective kind of corporate citizens when it comes to inclusion. So one of the things that's come out of all of this is that it's not just about customers or even suppliers. Many times in consumer, we talk about one end or the other. We talk about diversity and inclusion as it relates to customers, how we're reaching out to a more diverse customer market, how are we being more diverse in terms of the way that we face our customers. So who on the front line, whether it's through a commercial or who's in stores and so on and so forth, that group being diverse. Or we tend to focus on supplier diversity. What are the supplier diversity programs out there? How are we looping in and engaging minority and women-owned businesses? How are we empowering them to successfully fulfill their contract? But using the automotive as an example, as you just see, none of these exist in a vacuum across the value chain. So it's really important to think about diversity when it comes to each and every element of the value chain, and even like what the cause and effect is up and down the value chain. If you are choosing, I'm using dealers and service centers as an example. If you are choosing to really drive more diversity in terms of dealer ownership, what does that mean not only in terms of the customer experience? What does that mean thinking upstream in terms of mobility, fleet operators, and captive finance? So just kind of some food for thought there in terms of really seeing diversity and inclusion and the conversation expand across the entire value chain rather than this one end or the other, diverse customers or diverse suppliers. So there's significant risks of not getting DEI right. And we're seeing this in the environment a lot today. First being that loss of top talent. I'm sure I don't have to tell you this is the job seekers market, but employees are seeking more inclusive workplaces. And that is not only workplace in terms of who they are working with, but physically, how they're able to show up. And that can include hybrid environments and things like that. We're seeing this significantly impact women as well. And competitors nowadays are poaching a lot of diverse talent by really meeting them right where they are with what it is that they want and need to feel that sense of inclusion and sense of belonging. The STEM talent pipeline, this is about recruiting efforts. If your DEI strategy is not activated company-wide, you tend to have kind of a bottlenecked talent pipeline. Right? So paying attention to, hey, how are we incorporating DE&I recruiting across each and every element of the company, each and every function? That also includes where in careers that you engage people. It's not all just coming out of campus or out of graduate school, but also how are you, engaging those experienced hires? And then also customer attrition and brand decline. Will loyal customers pivot to competitors whose DEI efforts are more visible? We've seen this a lot over the last year and a half, with customers even paying attention to it's more than your PR statement or posting a black box on social media, et cetera. But customers really doing the double click and saying, what are the DEI efforts that companies are investing in, and what have been the outcomes, and what are they doing if those outcomes have been slow or fairly non-existent? And then sponsorship forfeiture. We've even seen sponsorships lost, especially of major events, or corporations choosing not to sponsor major events due to concerns about DEI vision not mattering or not being realized, or actually the sponsorship just not really advancing it in any sort of way. So you see all of these point to money and people, which are very key resources to companies. And so what does this mean for leaders, the leaders who are responsible for the people and the money? And what we have noticed is that leaders are often unaware of their personal impact on the business, with only 1/3 accurately assessing whether others experience them as inclusive. So in other words, this is about how they see themselves. I view it as leaders might say, yes, there is a problem with social injustice, or there's a problem with, gender inequity or racism, et cetera. But then if you ask them, are they contributing to it? Do they have, challenges around bias, et cetera? Everyone's answer is no, right? However, when we get out there and do the work, that's not necessarily what their peers and direct reports are saying. So only those leaders who can accurately assess whether others experience them as inclusive are able to have a truly positive impact on business outcomes. So it's really just kind of knowing who you are and having that good sense of cognizance of bias, and also fully understanding just the impact of your behaviors and how your people show up. And that includes how they are able to collaborate and innovate and feel that they contribute to an effective kind of business and work environment. So inclusive leadership is a capability we are seeing more and more companies invest in, right? And this actually goes beyond the training piece. But I'll talk a bit about what we mean when we mean inclusive leadership. And for us at Deloitte, we have what we call 6 signature traits of inclusive leadership. And this came from us doing research of global leaders across the global 1,000 and really paying attention via interviews and other social scientific research. What are kind of the key behaviors that those leaders are deemed to be most inclusive demonstrate? And they tend to fall into those 6 buckets you see on your screen, with 3 being inclusive mindsets and 3 being inclusive behaviors. So you have cognizance, which is the awareness that I was just talking about of bias. Curiosity in terms of actively seeking out and understanding different perspectives. Demonstrating cultural intelligence by meeting people where they are and being willing to adapt. Collaborating, this is not only how you collaborate, but how you empower others to collaborate. So no micromanaging, I'll say there. Commitment, where's the commitment to diversity and inclusion on a very personal leadership level, not just being able to point to the company's pillars or DEI strategy or vision statement, but how is a leader personally demonstrating commitment to DEI as a personal value? And courage. This includes vulnerability and bravery to challenge the status quo, and to also let their guard down and admit, hey, I'm on a DEI journey too. I don't always get it right. I can make mistakes, and this is why I need my team. So we've definitely done a lot of training and one-on-one coaching around developing the 6 signature traits of inclusive leadership. But also what we've done in this is really connected the dots between using and leaning into these 6 signature traits to impacting business and team performance. Right. So one of the things that we paid attention to when we were doing our research is that those leaders that were really coming out on top tended to lead teams that had improved performance. You can see the numbers there at the bottom. And also be a part of a greater organization and inclusive culture that improved business performance. And so really what's important here, and a trend that we're really working on, is really helping to connect those dots all the way from that business performance, that stock performance, that, you know, it matters to stakeholders, it matters to employees, and so on and so forth, really connecting it all the way back to the behaviors of individual and influential leaders in the organization. So our clients are really asking tough questions across consumer right now. And I'll briefly touch on the questions they're asking and kind of the way that we are answering or approaching the answer. The first is, how are we on our DEI practices compared to competitors? Get this one a lot. What we tend to say is that, you know, DEI practices or DEI strategies can be a lot like an outfit. What looks good on one person does not necessarily look good on another. So what we often do here is we ask questions about, hey, why do you have your eye on that competitor? What is it that they are doing in the DE&I space that, you know, feel could impact you or inspires or influences you? And then we work with them on their current capabilities, and that's capabilities both internally as well as analytically. To help them come up with DEI practices that really suit them. I say the outfit that really reflects the client. Then we get, what are we doing now in the DE&I space? How do I tie DE&I to the business? And what we do is we like to have what we call inclusive leadership experiences, where we really spend some time connecting the dots between bias and business outcomes. So I'm sure right now you've heard a lot about the trend around unconscious bias. There's unconscious bias trainings and this and that. But really what we like to do is go above and beyond and say, hey, when we see this type of bias, let's say a mini-me bias or an affinity bias, where we tend to, you know, hire and coach those people who look just like us, you know, let's trace that back. That can lead to a stifled talent pipeline. that can lead to us missing out on key capabilities and perspectives being at the table, right? And then look at how that can impact the solutions we come up with. An example I like to use is in the product development space. One trend we're seeing right now that's positive in the DE&I space, particularly in consumer products, is the expansion of color. And I say really addressing colorism that has been a problem in consumer products. I can say for myself as a woman of color, I recall struggling to find makeup that fits my skin tone, or I had to buy brown shoes because there's no such thing as a nude shoe that was in, my skin tone. But what you're really seeing now is, brands like Christian Louboutin has a whole nudes collection from the lightest skin color to the darkest skin color. We've seen Fenty become $1 billion business because it is serving a group that has been significantly underserved in the beauty industry. And what's that tell you? Oftentimes the voices that were left out at the table or were not heard at the table when it came to building beauty brands, nude colored shoes or nude colored clothing, etc. And so again, that's an example of a business outcome that can be impacted starting off all the way with affinity bias and not having certain people at the table. The bottom left, how do I train my leaders to be more inclusive? Now, one of the things that we often emphasize here is a lot of this comes from two things: helping leaders understand what being inclusive is and what being inclusive is not. Okay, so really laying a solid foundation in the company's vision, mission, and understanding of the definitions of words like diversity, equity, and inclusion, which, by the way, those terms can mean different things in different geographies. We're starting to do some global work and see that happen there. But also some of it is role modeling and accountability. So we work with specific leaders. This is where some of the one-on-one or small group coaching comes in on modeling some of these behaviors, and then on how to turn that into holding leaders accountable for demonstrating those behaviors, or more importantly, showing their zero tolerance for exclusive or biased behaviors. And then what should leaders start, stop, and continue doing? I will say 9 times out of 10, the answer is around accountability. Again, as I was saying up front, diversity, equity, and inclusion is not new in the business world, but what's just happening is it's not gaining traction because of the lack of accountability or even lack of alignment on how to hold leaders accountable. So usually we do kind of a double click there on everything from data that can be collected or used to help leaders hold leaders to specific targets, to also those loop surveys or leadership feedback surveys that sometimes float around kind of in outer space with not really a big action plan behind them when we see there's a problem with leadership, but really taking a lot of the tools in place and getting a tactical accountability and commitment plan for leaders. And so what we're learning is the learning curve is steep for DE&I. For those clients we tend to go to, and most of my clients are Fortune 500 consumer companies, they have a chief diversity officer, they have a global DE&I strategy, they have resource groups, but I tend to find some pitfalls and really some barriers to really helping those drive effective transformation. And I'll briefly speak to these. The first is talent data. Oftentimes the talent data is very limited or incomplete. Oftentimes talent data is collected heavily up front. You think of you're applying for a job or it's onboarding, you check all the boxes, right? But then after that, there's so many more talent processes, around development, around promotion, around performance management, around, if you think of HR investigations, who is retiring, what's the succession planning? And I noticed that there's not the same rigor around collecting demographic data and employee engagement data at each point in the talent process. And so incomplete data or not having data on those processes leads to incomplete conclusions or incomplete action items. Company ambition versus investment, having that whirlpool budget, but you want to boil the ocean. I've seen some fantastic and inspiring company ambitions, even for me and what I do with a really active and inclusive company. But then when I get down to struggling to get 6 figures behind it, goes back to my opening statement of just as you wouldn't throw $50,000 around a whole tech transformation, it's amazing the beliefs of let's throw $50,000 at a DEI transformation. Leadership constraints. And this can come in a couple of ways. By leadership constraints, sometimes we tend to overburden the women and people of color who are in leadership and have them run and sponsor everything. Sponsor the resource groups, lead the mentoring program, all that, and that can lead to them being overburdened. And it also can lead to a lack of alignment or perceived alignment amongst all leadership. And that's all are committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and all are carrying their weight. Then on the bottom left, you have flash versus impact. I spoke to this a bit earlier with having, the social media, black box and the great PR statements and, all of that. That's flash, but that's not really, impacting what has become a very systemic issue. If you think of it, companies did not get to where they are. The numbers I was showing you earlier with the lack of representation amongst CEOs in the Fortune 500 did not happen overnight. This is something that's happened generationally. And so we have to get at the systemic root of what led to that point to really drive change. The HR problem. DEI is not just an HR issue. It's not just a talent issue. Don't have all the DEI people sit only in HR. Don't have them only report to the CHRO. Really find ways to get every single function and every single functional leader engaged in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Again, going back to helping them understand the business outcomes. Mistaking exploration for action. I've come in and seen great assessments. Oh, Marin, we've already had a company come in and assess how we're doing. But then when I say, well, what was the action plan? What is the outcome? You uncovered the problem. Yes, that's very important, but really going beyond that. You uncovered a bias. How do you mitigate it? You uncovered a problem with succession planning. How are you addressing it? So making sure that there is an action plan that answers the so what of all of the assessments and explorations. And then viewing DEI as a program. Sometimes this can be as simple as language. When you refer to something as a DEI program or a DEI initiative, it minimizes it. It makes it seem like this small kind of, it starts in September and ends in October sort of concept, rather than just like your business plan is not a program. It's something that you work constantly, all 52 weeks of the year. And it's the same thing with your diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's embedding it into that business strategy, and both are worked throughout the year. And so now what? Before I open it up to questions, just want to say here, what is it that we are really helping consumer clients do right now? The first is acknowledge the issues. We're doing a lot of exploration across things like infrastructure, talent, analytics, leadership, culture. We do a lot of double clicking there to really see what are the capabilities across those foundational activators and what are some levers they can pull to really gain some momentum. Align at the top. We come and really work with leadership on getting aligned on the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion, the role that each of them should play in driving it forward, and how they should be held accountable and model behaviors for their organization. Recognize the benefits of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Really even getting to the quantifiable benefits of diversity, equity, and inclusion. One thing I've been doing with one of my clients is even making this fun, right? Just stopping and saying, hey, paying attention to the success of films like Black Panther. What was different there? Marvel dared to say not all superheroes have to be white with American accents. And look at that becoming the second highest gross film of all time. That's a business benefit of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the film industry. And kind of doing the same thing in your own respective industry of really, really paying attention to the benefits, not only qualitatively, but quantitatively. Create that clear strategy and implementation plan, and most importantly, double click it down to the stakeholder level. It's great to have this wonderful, strategy and implementation plan that has all the right language and all the right words. But if you can't hand this over to a key leader or a key stakeholder and they say, I know what I'm supposed to do to bring this to life, then it's not as clear as it needs to be. So we oftentimes help with that socialization, and we lean into the human capital element of it to really kind of drive some socialization and change management to drive the transformation. And the last is learning from others' experiences. We like to come together in some of the meetings I mentioned before, leadership alignment, current state assessment, and really share some of the successes and failures of other organizations so that they can learn from them. Also say, hey, what do you see in yourself in this organization, so that we can help you kind of navigate around some potential pitfalls. But again, just constantly learning. When it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, when everyone's on the same page, there really are not any losers, right? This is really about equitable outcomes for all, and there is enough room for everyone, including every company at the table on this topic. So I know I've said a lot here. I would love to pass it over to Allison to facilitate some Q&A, because I'd love to hear what's on your minds.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Marin. That was a very insightful presentation. And thank you, panelists, for joining us here today. I want to jump right in and get straight to the question we are here to answer. What has been the biggest internal or external DEI lesson learned? Panelists?
I mean, I can speak a bit here. I can say the biggest lesson that I am seeing learning is that a recruiting strategy is not enough. Most of the time when I do go in to companies, and when they think of diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's heavily focused on talent acquisition, recruiting, et cetera, and saying getting people in the door or going to a diversity conference or a different university than usual, whatever, is not enough. That is really just one small part of an overall diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. So I would say really getting them outside of DEI means, talent and recruiting has been a lesson.
Thank you, Marin. Simone, Chris?
Chris, I'll go ahead if that's okay. Great. So given Mari, the way that Mari kicked us off, I think I'll talk a little bit about where we are in terms of our ability to respond to bias crimes, hate crimes, and where our organization found that we were very reactionary and not proactive. And what I mean by that is we weren't necessarily prepared to support our community. We were sometimes slow in terms of developing statements. Do we make a statement? Do we not make a statement? There wasn't clarity on the council level. I think just not necessarily having alignment, because they had never had to deal with these issues before, which is its own issue, at an executive staff level, and those who were trying to provide support to them, and just assessing what our next steps were when these things happened, whether it was George Floyd's murder or incidents that were happening with our staff outside, operating on our Parks and Recreation department. And then how do we support our staff internally? Again, whether it's George Floyd's murder or whether or not it's an incident with our own staff, do we have the systems in place to really be able to adequately support our staff in situations like
that? For us, we're early in the journey, and I feel like I'd love to ask myself this question a year from now to see if my answers are the same, because I feel like the lessons are rapidly occurring and changing over time, and our perspective on them are changing. But I think key lessons for us have been that systems change is really complicated and messy for us. We have PowerPoint slides that are not messy, but when we actually sit down across from one another, these conversations are difficult and challenging. And this early work for us has really exposed, I think, some big work culture deficits. When Marin talked about the learning curve being steep, that really resonated with me, that in terms of our experience. On the flip side of that, I think we've learned that this will take time, and it's going to take persistence. And the way we think about it is metaphorically is that this is not a marathon, it's an ultra marathon. It's much more than that, and it certainly is not a sprint distance. And I think it's just an ongoing learning journey for the organization and the individuals inside. And I guess along the lines of persistence, one of the things that we learned, and we had a sense of this, is making a public commitment for us, publishing an equity statement. It created this before and after moment where there was an expectation set with the board and with the leadership and with the staff that this was a commitment. And what that really helped to do was it put us out there, and it said, this is what we're going to do. You can now assess us on our progress towards this. And it being a small organization where, where the margins are exceedingly thin, and we're the equivalent of a paycheck to paycheck organization, it really helped us to cement an investment strategy to actually put resources aside to move this forward.
Thank you, Chris and Simone, for your comments. I think some of you touched on some of the issues raised actually in Marin's presentation. And so I'd like to kind of take some of those threads and move this forward into the next question around barriers. What do you all see as the biggest barrier to moving DEI forward?
I would say fear. And I will say fear of missteps and mistakes. And that can be on an individual level, a person fearing that, hey, I'm going to end up saying the wrong thing, doing the right thing, and hurting the actual person or community I'm trying to help. And then same thing with corporations, in terms of fear of not only that same sort of a thing, but also fear of, if we move in this direction, who could we potentially alienate? Now, one of the things we're beginning to see take place is there are just some consumer brands that are fine with it. They're saying, this is so much of what we stand for, it's so much of what we believe in, we're okay with that. With Nike, with Ben and Jerry's, et cetera. You see them saying, hey, this is what we stand for. You can get off the bus here if this is not what, if this is not you. Right? We have seen the mistake of the tap dance with Hallmark and Crown Media, where they seem to be, inclusive of LGBTQIA families in a commercial, and then they stepped back and they got the backlash from one community, but then tried to course correct, and it turned into this, well, where do you stand? And that was actually worse than them doing nothing at all. So I'm seeing a lot of fear, and the way we try to get over that is really equipping individuals and companies with tools and frameworks, so that they know how to address situations when they rise. And also helping them be comfortable with, hey, you're not going to please everybody. There are going to be some people who walk away, but that's also the power of consumerism, right?
Chris, Simone?
Yeah, I really appreciate that sort of on the bus, off the bus piece, like saying, hey, this is where we're going. This is who we are. And I found myself having those types of conversations in board settings around, not necessarily directly with one individual, but where there was fear and resistance about moving in a direction or making a commitment that the thing I heard was, well, what are our donors? They're more than 30% of our revenue comes from private donations. What if they're not on board? And so I think pushing through that and pushing through that fear and saying, what? On the other side, we want to be an organization that stands behind this change and our commitment. And it was, for us so far anyway, it's really been not a rational fear, in that our donors are even have shown a deeper commitment to us making this commitment. And so I think that it actually, that was a little bit more of a boogeyman. We did a lot of self-assessment as we started to get out of the gate. And in terms of biggest barrier, I think that it became clear to us really early on that if we wanted to move forward with DEI, we needed to strengthen our culture. We had just really significant trust issues, and we needed to build consensus around shared values and group agreements, just kind of the basic ingredients to push the organization and move the organization collaboratively through change. And then Marin talked about accountability, and that was probably the biggest piece that came out of the assessment that we did, was around needing to improve accountability across the board, particularly across leadership.
Simone, would you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I appreciate both Chris and Marin's comments, and Marin in particular, that just that word fear I think fear sometimes manifests itself as unwillingness to really examine how we show up in power structures, and not just how we show up as individuals, but how does that impact all of our staff? And are we properly living out our values and our equity statements and our core values that community helped contribute to? Are we just kind of pushing back, living out of that fear? And I think, we being in government, that we are a white supremacist organization, and it's hard to put that language for people to just go ahead and grab onto that and say, organizationally, structurally, this is who we are, and we have to be really active in having conversations about race really openly. And we're still learning how to do that, both at an elected official level and, in terms of our staff and employees and leadership. And I think that it's hard work. I think there's some recognition that it needs to happen, but when we look at our foundational equity training that we rolled out as a mandatory training this past year, we saw the comments that put people on a spectrum. This is too basic. And then we have the folks who were, this is not part of my job. And so how do you start talking to people about, if you are a public servant, then this is part of your job. Every day in, day out, whether you're in utility billing, you're a water meter reader, or you are a city manager. And so trying to have those conversations specifically around race, knowing that it impacts every other identity, is just really challenging, but it's work we need to do.
Well, thank you all for those insights. And, Simone, you mentioned the importance of having this embedded in positions, in individuals, and making that sort of systemic change across organizations. I have a question specifically for you about the city of Hillsboro. We know that recently, city of Hillsboro has created a full-time permanent diversity manager who works directly with senior staff. And we've seen a lot of organizations create similar job positions over the past few months. Would you please briefly talk about why now, and the kinds of commitment and investments you feel the city has made to ensure the success of this position?
Money. I think, we have to resource these positions. We started out, we did not have a DEI manager. To your point, we recently hired for this position. Originally, I was hired as an assistant city manager as DEI as part of my body of work. As part of my introduction, I was supervising our parks and recreation, our HR, our library, our communications division, DEI, homelessness, our 2035 community plan, all of that. And I was supposed to somehow lead DEI and really prioritize it for an entire organization that had really only just barely dipped its toe in that work, starting in 2012 with the diversity committee that was focused on workforce diversity, and not inclusion and not equity. And then moving to having an equity team that started the same year I did, that managed to move forward an equity statement that the council prioritized after receiving 2 hours of training. I will say, after 2 hours of training, they were like, oh my gosh, DEI. They didn't have a lot of language around it, but they at least recognized that it needed to be part of our values. But that equity statement, trying to then operationalize that as a 1/6 of my workload, people, employees, the council, our city manager recognized that we were not going to be able to operationalize that work without a position and with adequate funding to actually be able to provide training and to assist with strategic planning. So, I think, contributing upwards of 6 figures towards a budget for DEI, we are very fortunate to be a well-resourced city, and then actually being able to bring in a DEI manager to really assist with moving that work forward. You did bring up working with senior leaders, and I think that is something we still are learning how to do. There is building trust within an organization that has not done this work previously, and having a person of color who is in the DEI manager role to be able to have those conversations about race with individuals who this is new. it just takes some trust building. And so also where this position is located within the organization doesn't lend itself to authority, it lends itself to influence. And those are two very different things. And so just learning to navigate that as we have this settle in. We're only a couple months into it, so we'll get better, but there's a lot of work to be done. But I'm very fortunate to have a very talented staff person who I believe is on this call, and looking forward to moving the work forward.
That sounds amazing, Simone. And I think your emphasis on trust building and having the difficult conversations about race are so important for organizations to develop sort of that institutional fortitude around to be able to do this kind of work. I think I'm going to pivot right now and ask Chris a little bit about Neighborhood House. Neighborhood House began its diversity work in 2019. And I'd really like to know a little bit more about how that work has shifted in 2020 since George Floyd and the pandemic. When we talk about trust and difficult conversations, especially around race, I'm curious how you have managed, or Neighborhood House has managed, to navigate those complex issues.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think before the murder of George Floyd, as a historically white-led organization, kind of layered, also being a nonprofit with this perpetual struggle with the bottom line, we talked about DEI at a high level, and we were aspirational and wanting to put plans together and dig in and start to do work. But we really had, it was embedded in our strategic plan. So we had made that sort of, at least that formalized the commitment in that way. But I think we really had trouble finding a path and making the work a priority, gaining momentum. There always seemed to be a fire to put out, right? And when Simone talks about money, that is a very real barrier to us. The nonprofit funding world is one that demands attention to DEI, and rightfully so, because a lot of the work that we're doing is safety net and Band-Aid work to address systemic inequity. And so, but the funding landscape doesn't necessarily bring the money when it comes in terms of supporting the work. So it's really up to us. And when the protest started, the dialogue changed literally overnight. The conversations on equity were happening in meetings every single day. For many on our board, staff donors, especially those with unearned privilege, this was a before and after moment, and they were energized, wanting to learn more about their role in systemic oppression, wanting to change their relationship with racist systems. And I think for the challenge has been sort of channeling those individual journeys into a collective journey. How do we come together as an organizational body that's making decisions that impact the communities that we serve? How do we include those communities more than we have in the past in helping us to design our programs and our response? That's been the challenge for us, is coming together. So I guess the short answer is there was a significant change overnight, and I think we've used that to help us move forward. We've used that will to help us move forward.
Thank you, Chris. When we think about organizations, we realize that human resources aren't just abstractions. These are human beings with thoughts, dreams, wishes, hopes, desires, and yes, frustrations. One of the biggest and most important things we can do as leaders is hiring good people who will advance the work that we are hoping to accomplish in our organizations. I think we've all seen what's happened with COVID-19. We've seen a lot of people kind of go into a deeper self-reflection about their roles and the meaning of their work. And we have seen what is now called the Great Resignation, or the turnover tsunami, right? As a result, we have employers struggling to be able to recruit talent and even to retain talent. I'm curious from all of you on this call, what is your take or advice on things employers can do to attract or retain talent?
I can start off by saying this goes back to data, and I know I talked a bit about talent data, and not enough employers are doing enough to capture data around why people are leaving, right? Those exit interviews seem to be selected and far between. Even again, capturing the workforce demographic data and paying attention to, hey, is there a specific group that you're losing, whether it's Blacks and African Americans, whether it's women, anything of that sort, to really then do that double click and see what's going on, is something that I'm really seeing a lot of employers are not doing. So then they're not making data-informed decisions. They're throwing darts at a dartboard and seeing what sticks, or assuming that the answer is money. Right. So I would say, spending more time doing that listening and engaging with those who have left, even with those who have recently left. I just helped a client set up post-exit interviews with those who have left during the pandemic, specifically within this calendar year, to have conversations that, quite frankly, should have been had earlier. And then seeing what trends that they can identify there so they can begin to take action before people leave. But I would say a lot of it is around doing some listening and engaging and data capture.
Marin, you made an interesting point in your presentation that the pandemic has disproportionately affected women. And I'd like to just hear a little bit more. This is a follow-up to that.
Yes, I think that the last number that I saw was about 2 million women had left the workforce during the pandemic with zero plan to return, whether that's returning full-time or returning in the same capacity. And among the top challenges are around childcare. Kind of what I see as seeing that in this hybrid environment, it's no longer work-life balance, it's work-life integration. Right. And really companies needing to find a way to meet them where they are. Some examples that I'm seeing are companies providing in parts of their benefits plan a stipend that can go towards childcare, or using some sort of program where mothers only have to pay like a copay. Being more flexible with working hours. I've also seen some clients say, hey, if you can work with your team in terms of your working hours, if you need to work from 8 to noon, then take noon to 2 off to educate your kids and then come back online at 2, we're fine with that. And so allowing for a lot more of the flexibility there, but usually childcare tends to be the number one. Now, of course, there are some challenges there in terms of factors outside of our control, if schools are going back in session or not, right? But I would say companies really have to lean into what resources that they do have available, in whether it's providing childcare on site. I also had a client say that they are looking at having some various like tutoring rooms and childcare rooms on site that can help a woman come into the office and know that her child is nearby doing homework or is being looked after, things like that. But it's finding a way of having a conversation around work-life integration with women.
Thank you, Marin. Simone, Chris, do you have anything to add to the Great Resignation or the turnover tsunami?
Well, just sort of commenting on Marin's response about childcare. I mean, I think that one of the lessons that we learned from the pandemic was the value of the public school system as a childcare provider. I mean, yes, they're an educational provider, but remove that care aspect, and particularly for the families that we serve, families living in poverty or families that are living paycheck to paycheck and are employed primarily in the service industry, is that childcare flexibility, times of the day are really important. And we've seen, I think this is an area that, we sort of have our collective fingers crossed around more public investment in terms of providing low-cost childcare. I know the state of Oregon, we've taken part in launching this Oregon Childcare Alliance, where it's a statewide initiative to provide shared resources for small daycares and childcares throughout the state, really with the idea of if we can support these small businesses in helping them to create efficiencies and recruiting and recruiting families and help with their back end business, that they can then increase the supply of affordable childcare. So I think that there are some systemic things to address, and that's what we hear when we talk to our families that are having trouble paying rent, having trouble putting food on the table, is that the number one barrier is around childcare, to wealth building is around childcare.
Simone, would you like to add?
Just briefly, I think in terms of retention, we've worked really hard and attracting employees, but more on the retention pieces, doing our very best to support them. Again, as I mentioned, we are probably a better resource city than some, and we were lucky enough to be able to receive CARES funding as well as ARPA funding. But doing things like providing distance learning leave and emergency COVID leave, 40 hours of each, and really being able to support employees with remote work where possible, and where they didn't necessarily have work but would need to be out of the office, particularly like our library employees who not all of them had work that they could do, allowing them to do training and be pay compensated for that, and really trying to be flexible, particularly in the early months as this was going on. But then doing our, to Marin's point about just understanding the data, is really, we've done 2 COVID-19, what we're calling COVID-19 surveys, to assess where employees are in terms of their satisfaction with communication with supervisors, with the benefits they're receiving, how are they coping, and really trying to adjust our tactics to address those things. And then trying to get that information back out to staff. So we've really upped our level of engagement, or at least communication with staff. I think we still have some room to move in terms of doing actual engagement, but we really tried to focus on the benefits piece quite a bit. The other piece of the data, just in terms of like turnover, and I appreciate Marin mentioning that in organizations not necessarily tracking, is we didn't even have systems that would really allow us to do that well. We were tracking some things just in Excel spreadsheets. And now we have a system on board that we can start to do that. And so we can dig into that data and revisit it on at least an annual basis. So.
No, thank you, Simone. You mentioned remote and hybrid work opportunities, and that seems to be one of the buzzwords that's come out of COVID-19, this desire for remote and hybrid opportunities. Marin, I'm going to pivot this question to you and ask, as we move into potential hybrid or full remote work situations, what are some equity issues that employers need to address? And do you have examples of organizations that are doing this well?
Starting off to the latter, I would say there's pretty much a no at this point in time. Everyone's figuring this out. But what's really coming out is paying attention to your diversity, equity, and inclusion across your organization. What's tending to happen is by moving to a hybrid or work from home model, many companies, especially consumer companies, are beginning to find this impacts their diversity and inclusion because many of their Black and brown workforce are at the storefront or at the manufacturing plant in jobs that cannot be done remotely. So it does mean kind of reshaping and redefining the job and paying attention to the way tasks are done and then skilling them up accordingly. So we're really seeing this play out in terms of when stores were closed and different things like that, the significant financial impact on Black and brown communities. A lot of that had to do with, the number of them who are in kind of quote unquote front line, in storefronts, in grocery storefronts, in distribution warehouses, and so on and so forth, in comparison to those who are in quote unquote white collar or corporate jobs. So it's a really taking a step back and looking at the way tasks are done and can be done, and upskilling those people, and even shifting the career paths. I know one of the things we see a lot in consumer is that the career path to corporate does not even connects at the store level. Usually at the store level, the highest you can go is some sort of district sales manager of sorts. And then those people who might go from that to corporate are kind of viewed as unicorns. So really stopping and saying, let's redefine the career pathing as well, so that there are opportunities for people who do start off in the stores or in the front line to eventually be upskilled or have the appropriate development opportunities to land at corporate. So that's the biggest thing that I'm seeing really play out here is paying attention to where your diverse workforce tends to sit.
Yeah, thank you, Marin. And in thinking about that, that means that we really need to have a holistic assessment of our workforce. And so I think going back again to our first part of the conversation around systemic change really requires this sort of holistic assessment. I know we're getting close to time where we're going to invite the audience to ask questions. I just have one last question for you all before we move to the audience Q&A. Each of your organizations issued a public statement shortly after the murder of George Floyd. Could you please summarize the statement and tell us what your organization has done to fulfill the pledge? Any comments or thoughts, Marin?
So I know one of the first things that Deloitte did two things up front. One of the things that we did is we released a paper called Support Your Black Workforce Now. And it provides a framework for really supporting, I would say, any particular workforce that is significantly hurting or has dealt with increased trauma. As we know, we also saw this happen with anti-Asian sentiments, with anti-Semitic sentiments, et cetera. And so we put out there a framework that involved active listening, actively engaging, actively acknowledging, and actively doing to really help a company wrap its arms around a hurting community. We did that, number one. The second thing we did is we stood up internally what's called the Black Action Council here, and it was for them to do that here within Deloitte. It really opened our own firm's eyes to some challenges that we have had with our Black workforce. A lot of it in terms of inclusion, not necessarily in recruiting, and through kind of applying our own framework, beginning to really provide more support, more sponsorship, and some of that is even psychological, and providing more kind of trauma and counseling sort of support. But those are just some examples that we have really started doing here, and we're starting to really expand that to other communities that have been impacted by similar traumas over the last year.
Thank you, Marin.
Chris?
We first published an equity statement as part of our strategic planning process in 2019, and then we came together and revised it after the murder of George Floyd, and really committed to becoming a learning organization, transforming practices, policies, programs that were perpetuating structural racism. We recognize that racism is a public health crisis. And then we made the commitment to become an anti-racist organization. And for us, that meant really leaning into these systems. We by mission, have always been responsive to wealth inequity with our various safety net services. But from a strategic standpoint, we've started to really shift our focus to wealth building initiatives, focusing on immigrant and BIPOC communities. I think we're beginning to show up in ways that we haven't before in terms of being advocates and partners with BIPOC-led organizations, and those are mostly other nonprofits. An example of that in Portland is the Southwest Equity Coalition, which is really charting, overseeing the development of the Barber Corridor in Southwest Portland to sort of disrupt the way that these public investments end up creating further inequity, right? So stating the equitable outcomes that we want, using community engagement to define those, and then really holding public leaders accountable. But for us, I think that learning organization thing is really important, and that we have to invest in that learning. We have to find ways, me saying that the non-traditional nonprofit funding routes don't support administrative overhead, let alone these types of efforts, that's not acceptable as an excuse. We have to find ways to fund this journey. We have to find ways to invest in recruiting and retaining a more diverse workforce, creating an inclusive environment. And that starts, I don't know where it starts, but that I would say that includes all the way from our board level through our senior leadership, through our administrative leadership and to our direct service workers. And we're all sort of on the bus to bring that metaphor back.
Thank you, Chris.
So our statement is primarily a video. So it involves our mayor and one of our city councilors. I would say it acknowledges that racism exists against the Black people, the Black community, that there are inequities, particularly economic, housing, services, that there is a lack of political power that has existed historically and currently. And then it spoke to our city's commitment to changing the way we, changing our policies, practices, programs, services, to be more in alignment with the outcomes we say that we want to achieve in terms of our equity statement and achieving equitable outcomes. We're still working towards that. I think one of the things that did come out of it was the approval of a community engagement manager position. I think there was a realization that we need to have community, particularly communities of color, participating in our political process, if we're going to be able to change those policies. And that needs to happen at more than just our Civic Leadership Academy, where 13 people go through and we work to get them on boards and commissions, but that's inadequate in terms of informing our processes, whether it's land use or library services. And so I think, that was this, we just got that this year. It was approved after our diversity, equity, and inclusion manager was approved. So I think that was a big win, is to actually, again, resource ways to get community involved and move closer to a shared decision-making model, which government is just beginning to learn how to do. And so, while we may have done that on a programmatic level in areas of the city, it's new work, I think, more broadly in terms of policy and changing what services we deliver, where we deliver them to, and whether or not that's actually what community would prioritize.
Well, thank you so much, Simone, and really thank you all panelists for participating here in this Q&A. I know that we have a number of audience questions, so we are going to shift at this time to the Executive Director, Mari Watanabe, who will moderate our audience Q&A. Again, thank you so much for all these lessons learned. I know this will go a long way in helping us be better community partners and advancing the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Thank you, Allison. And thank you, panelists. I do have some questions from the audience. So one of the questions is about boards. And so Marin, corporate boards, and then Chris, nonprofit boards. So how have you seen good examples of how governing boards can support this work and model it themselves? So maybe Chris, do you want to start off?
Oh yeah, Chris, you can
sorry,
go.
Marin, go ahead. Marin, go ahead.
So pretty much the way that I have seen a board be effective is kind of two ways. Number one is really holding the C-suite accountable to diversity, equity, and inclusion goals and targets, demanding that the quarterly board meetings do have diversity, equity, and inclusion as a topic consistently on the agenda, with expected progress reports on where they are in hitting specific targets, and an expected action plan on if they are not hitting those targets. So that's one way. The second piece is really taking a look at their succession plan for their board. What are they going to do to get more people at the table, particularly more underrepresented groups? So really even having a firm like Deloitte or other boutique diversity and inclusion firms come in and look at their succession planning processes and really pay attention to anything systemic that's embedded in there that needs to be addressed, or even what's happening with the processes in and of itself that could be exacerbating bias. So those have been kind of two real ways I've seen boards take action that's been really impactful.
Thanks.
I want to upvote both of those. The accountability piece, certainly the importance of the board holding the C-suite staff accountable. In the nonprofit sector, these are all volunteers, and so there's a certain aspect of managing up that needs to happen. There's accountability that goes the other direction too. So it's the staff holding the board accountable for, we attract board members based on their affinity to our mission and their affinity to our vision. And our vision certainly includes equity. And so that's kind of at the lead. And so sort of the historic white supremacist voices well, let's stay focused on this, or we can't find diverse board members, or kind of all of the excuses that we hear, not accepting those and saying that's not, we've defined the direction that we want to go, and we need you as a board to really support that and to be communicating that through your networks out into the community as part of recruitment. And speaking to that recruitment piece, we have really in the last, I would say 3 or 4 years, have really focused on recruiting board members with lived experience with poverty onto our board. And I have to tell you that has completely changed the dialogue around the boardroom table. It has just, it's sort of an aha moment for the organization. The value of having representation from members of the community who have experience in what the mission of our organization is all about. So, and then I think in terms of recruiting, leveraging the networks of the communities that we serve to find future board members, and there's some practical things too. Relaxing the give-get requirements when that's not a reality for somebody who's coming out of the board who is living in poverty, right? And so understanding that board members bring value in different ways, and that this isn't just simply a fundraising board, that this is a strategic board and a functional board.
Yeah, great. Those are great. So one of the questions is about inclusion. So do you make your organization's been doing
Marie, your audio is cutting in and out. Can you please repeat?
Sorry. So the question is, so how might you address an organization's concern that they want to create a more inclusive climate before focusing on recruiting more people of color? So a little bit chicken and the egg thing. So anybody have any ideas?
Well, I would say that that's not necessarily wrong, quote unquote, but that can be a bit of a pendulum swing. As I spoke to earlier in my presentation, I tend to view diversity and inclusion as a bit of a yin yang relationship. So one of the things I like about what they're doing is that more inclusion begets more diversity, right? And they're looking for a way to get off that hamster wheel of we're getting people in here, but we're losing them. And, that's costly in a lot of different ways, relationally, qualitatively, and quantitatively in doing that. So stopping and saying, what can we do to really fix that issue before bringing others in, I get, but I would say it is a yin yang, that more inclusion will beget more diversity. You become known as an inclusive employer, and some of the stats I quoted earlier will make you more attractive. And then when you are more diverse, you're able to be more inclusive. What's challenging around inclusion, especially when there's no focus on diversity, is you're sitting there and you're asking people to be inclusive or add a sense of belonging to people who are kind of already like them, right? Which is easy. the hard part is being inclusive to that person who comes in who's new. So that's why I would shy away from only focusing on inclusion. I would encourage them to look at it more as a yin yang, that more inclusion does beget more diversity, which begets more inclusion, and finding that balance. But being careful that you're not saying, hey, how can we be more inclusive when we all went to the same universities and are from the same places and all of that other.
Thanks, Marin. Chris or Simone?
That was such a great answer. I don't have anything to add.
Simone, did you have
Likewise, I echo that.
Okay, great. So thank you, Marin. So one of the questions is about how lower level employees can push leaders to care about DE&I with genuine, I would say, authenticity, accountability without hurting our perceived professionalism.
I know one of the things that I definitely encourage leaders to do, and I would actually encourage frontline workers to do as well, which is engage your resource groups to schedule listening sessions. Oftentimes, if you do it in that sort of collaborative, sort of way, you're still doing it in a professional environment, but we know resource groups are kind of deemed to be extracurriculars, right? But really, sitting down with your resource group and say, hey, can we have a listening session? And really, I challenge leaders to come and do just that, listen, and tell them that is what is expected of them, not to come with their team, ready to make statements and, that tend to be prepared and things like that, but say, hey, we want you here to listen and start there. And then, after they've had a chance to listen and to process, then make an ask. This is why it is that we wanted you here. That's the best way that I would encourage them to do that. And I find listening sessions to be among the most impactful because, again, many of the top leaders of organizations tend to be pretty removed, either in tenure or removed in socioeconomic status, an element of diversity we don't talk about enough. From what's happening with frontline workers, that they just sometimes need to sit and hear about the experiences that they're having.
Yeah, in terms of I'm looking at the 6 C's that Marin gave us earlier, and that cognizance piece to me is something really to focus on. We've put in place some safe feedback loops that are regular. The one example of one is that as the executive director, I have a 360 review each year where there are interviews with a cross section of staff, some of whom I don't come into regular contact with, but certainly giving them the opportunity to talk about how the organization is living up to its values, its equity commitments, its service commitments, its support of staff. And I've just found that to be such a valuable tool. Yes, getting in front of staff and having listening sessions and feedback sessions are valuable. We have just a pragmatic reality that I can't call in all hands at my organization. It's just because of the way that we're deployed, and we have teachers and we have direct service workers that coordinating that is a challenge. It doesn't mean that we can't do it, but also one of the things that I've noticed between feedback I've gotten in listening sessions versus feedback that I get in a safer space where somebody is maybe giving written feedback that's anonymized, or they're being interviewed by a board member about the organization, about my leadership, is that there's a little bit deeper, there's a little bit more depth to the feedback that I get when it's in a safer space.
Simone?
Yeah, I appreciate Marin's recommendation to go to employee resource groups. I think our problem is that we don't have very many, and we don't have one that incorporates people of color, certainly not specific to, our Latinx employees or our Black employees. And so that's a difficult path to follow. Our equity team is now in its second iteration, but I think there's a lack of clarity on how to get to those team members and how effective speaking to them is, what are the implications of sharing. I think it's a relatively safe space, but does it go anywhere, and is there any impact? And I think that can be frustrating to staff, particularly our employees of color, who have been, had to wait to even get in the door, and then they got in the door and they have to wait for promotions, and they have to wait for their voice to be heard. And I know that there have been some historical pieces where the groups have been formed and then essentially retired, perhaps because they were too effective. So I think we're still learning in leadership to listen to voices, to be expected to do that, and to then be accountable when there aren't changes in outcomes. But part of that is just not having the data. I know Marin has mentioned data on several occasions. It's really hard to hold people accountable at all levels, all levels of supervision, when there's no data to hold them accountable to. And so that's one of our first things our DEI manager is rolling out, is a racial equity survey. It's just a starting point, and then 6 months after that, a broader employee engagement survey, so we can start getting some data to work with, so we can really have some accountability mechanisms. So it's difficult right now. We do have a mentoring program which helps create some one-on-one relationships, but it's a challenge in our organization.
Thanks, Simone. Okay, last question, and we're a little bit short on time, so I'm going to ask for really succinct answers. But it might be a more difficult question to be succinct, but it's about trust, building trust. So there's a lot of things you've talked about to help open those doors and be more inclusive, but that trust building is still an issue. So how has your organization built trust?
I would say we've encouraged everyone to focus a lot more on impact versus intent. That's been one thing, is extending grace to one another and grace to ourselves by saying, for the most part, people mean well, even when making missteps, but help guide them through conversation and resources and understanding the impact of their statement or behavior. And then the second piece has really been addressing the fear element. But we understand, like, we're not here to take things away from people or anything like that. This is not, we're only going to focus on one group, and stop focusing on white males or anything like that at all. But it's not an either or conversation, but a yes and. And it's about who we're inviting into the conversation, and also invoking empathy through fear for those who are fearful of, I'm going to be left out, I'm going to be forgotten about, reminding them that is how underrepresented groups have been feeling. And so now that you can relate to that, how can we, bring everyone together and say, now we know what this feels like, and get everyone on the same page around why addressing it is important.
Thanks, Marin.
I think for us, it's important that we continue to not just be reactive to situations, but that we, as Steve is here and building out that DEI framework and actually having a strategy that people can see and that's communicated to employees, and understanding that part of that framework involves accountability for leadership and ultimately for all staff. I think that will increase the trust, because I think right now there's a little bit of, it happens, but will it continue? So is this sustainable?
Thanks, Simone. Chris.
Yeah, I think for us, transparency in communication, particularly around decision making, is we've heard is really important and valued. And I think collaborative shared leadership, coming up in a decision making model that really includes stakeholder voices, is something that's been identified. I felt like we were really on track there, and the feedback I got was we want more collaboration. I think the last one is centering around sort of our group agreements and our shared values. That goes a long way in terms of assuming best intent and sort of setting the ground rules around communication and the expectations around the way that we care for one another in the workplace. And that helps us to avoid sort of put unnecessary road bumps in place or create conflict that isn't useful or helpful, and it can be destructive.
Great. Thank you, panelists. I'm going to have to end this. Unfortunately, it's about 1 minute to 10. So I want to thank Marin, Simone, Chris, and Allison for sharing this space with us and bringing forth such thoughtful insights about DEI lessons we've learned over the last year. And for those in the audience, I hope this gives you some solid examples and ideas that you can take back to your organization, as well as inspiration to continue this work. Before you leave, please take a few minutes to send us your feedback. It will help us better serve you. And the survey is being posted in the chat box right now. It'll also pop up in your browser when you leave the webinar. So again, thank you for being here. Thank you again to our panelists. We hope to see you at our next program with John Powell. So thank you and have a great day.